Back in 1995, a man who went by the name of Jerry H. was hiking in the Grand Teton National Park. Jerry was 28 years old and in fine health. He wasn't an expert by any means at the wilderness, but he considered himself intelligent enough to be able to tackle any problems he might encounter. He had been out for a week and had begun his journey back to where his car was parked. He had about 3 days left of travel time before he would reach the trail leading back to his car. It was midsummer, so he was camping during the heat of the day and was hiking in the early and late hours of the day. It was late afternoon and he was hiking until the sun started to set, and at that time he would throw up a tent for the night. There wasn't a lot of breeze, so when he walked into the stench of something recently having died, the odor lingered in the air like a patron waiting for a bus. Thankfully, he still had a couple hours of hiking time before he had to stop and set up his tent, so he would be out of range of this stink by the time he had to settle in for the night. He had fished that morning and enjoyed some luck, so he had trout to fix for dinner. So he wasn't entirely surprised when he heard something moving through the brush back behind him and off to his right. He hadn't been following any trail, so it was unlikely to be another human being. Could be a bear that picked up the scent of the trout. Jerry didn't relish the idea of running into a hungry bear. He began to move a little faster away from the area. 15 minutes of pushing his way through the thicker part of the forest had done nothing to diminish the strength of that odor that he had walked into, and on top of that he could still hear something moving through the woods back behind him. Jerry was at a higher elevation and his journey back to his car would be all downhill. He came out at a spot that overlooked the valley down below. Now he would have to work his way along the top of the slope until he could find a spot easier to climb down than where he had come out. He had planned on camping along the top of the ridge that night, but because he had been moving as quickly as possible, he had arrived sooner than expected. He had time to probably make it down a good distance before he was forced to make camp. It was a no-brainer considering he could still hear something moving around back behind him. It had backed away some, but he still knew it was back there. Jerry figured if it was a bear, it would make its appearance when he started cooking dinner. The scent of the fish cooking would be too much to resist. Jerry wasn't exactly an old hand at dealing with hungry bears, so he felt extremely anxious about what to do about his situation. If there was anything good to build on, it would have been the fact that he had managed to get out of reach of that terrible dead odor. He was glad to have that in the rearview mirror. He didn't have a gun. Jerry didn't believe in them. Bear spray was basically his go-to, but he did carry with him 2 M80 firecrackers that a friend had smuggled into the country from Mexico. They were said to be equal to 1/6 of a stick of dynamite. He didn't know about that, but he did know they were the loudest things he had ever experienced, and he felt very confident that if he ever had to use one, that it would be sufficient to scare away even the most intimidating of bears, regardless being a black, grizzly or even polar. If that wasn't enough, then the rush of hot air he experienced when trying out the firecrackers from a safe distance away would be. It took no genius to understand that if you were within 20 feet of the explosion, it would be increasingly unpleasant for every foot you got closer. He once tied one of them to a rock, lit it and let the thing sink into the depths of the lake where he was visiting, and the explosion under the water brought up a couple of fish. They were very potent fireworks, which explains why you had to smuggle them into the country if you wanted to have them. Jerry kept one in his pack and one in his pocket for fast retrieval. He wasn't entirely sure which he would go for first if he ever came upon a bear. It appeared he might find out this night. Jerry hurried through the brush along the top of the ridge, and as he picked up his pace, he could hear whatever was following had begun to stop worrying about being quiet. It seemed more concerned now about keeping pace, which worried Jerry further. The thing seemed locked on his backside. Finally, he came upon a spot that looked like he could make his way down without needing an elevator. It looked like there might be a couple of spots where he might be better off using a rope to get past, but actually it was perfect for losing whatever was trailing him. He would at the very least be able to see what was coming down behind him. There wasn't enough tall cover going down the slope to hide anything of size. Jerry quickly started his way down. As soon as he started the downward direction, he became much more aware of the shadows, which were growing bigger at an ever faster increasing rate. Along the top of the ridge, the amount of sunlight remaining in the day had been misleading. There was no getting around it. This place was freaking spooky. Behind and to the west was the area where it had been too sharp of a slope to easily climb down. However, that stretch of the mountainside was rich with pine trees which cast long shadows that reached over to where he was climbing down. In the back of his mind, perhaps as a way of keeping his thoughts off of what was following, Jerry recognized he was coming down an area that must have been a slide a few hundred or thousand years ago. The slide had provided a softer grade to traverse the downhill journey. It was of course still very steep, but much preferred over having to wrap a rope around the trunk of a tree and use it to climb down. That was a tricky endeavor because it involved using a gravity knot so that when you reached the end of the rope you could find suitable footing, and then when you let off the stress of your weight on the rope it would usually be enough to get the rope to come loose. There were times when that didn't work, however, and it was a huge pain in the backside. Depending on your situation, you had to either leave the rope there or climb up and do the whole process over again, this time hoping the knot will work like it should. Then there was the possibility you could somehow get some slack due to a bounce or applying the wrong footing, and bam! Your rope has come loose and you're falling. If you do everything correctly you won't ever have to use the rope, but it is a great thing to have with you in case it is needed. A person can improvise a lot of things when they have to, but unless you are in a forest or jungle that has long vines which are strong enough they can be relied upon to hold your weight, carrying a rope with you is a very good idea. The shadows were starting to grow so fast you could see it happening with the bare eye. Jerry spotted an area which was flat enough to allow a tent to be set up that jutted out away from the mountain slope enough so that you couldn't approach the campsite from any direction except one, which was the slope itself. Better was that it didn't stand so far away from the mountain that he couldn't jump off any of the other three sides and not survive the fall. He hurriedly put up the tent because if there was any time to spare he had one more little task to do. Jerry set the tent up and got a fire started. There was still enough light left that it was illuminating the tops of the trees, which gave the landscape a weird contrast of the dark versus the sunlit green of the tops of the pines. He took his rope and walked down about 20 feet and climbed one of the pines which was bordering the area where the slide had happened. He went as far up as possible and then shimmied out on one of its limbs as far as he was comfortable. Then he tied off the end of the rope he carried into a slip-loose knot, and then he took out a reel of fishing line he carried in his pack and tied it to the end of the rope and then let the reel of fishing line free fall down to the ground. Coming down was trickier than going up. Jerry produced a small flashlight and stuck it in between his ball cap and his scalp. He had been able to see what he needed to see climbing up, having the blue sky above as a background to be able to locate the limbs of the pine. Coming down everything looked black as night. At the bottom of the pine tree he located the fishing line, which still had most of it in the reel. It was brought alongside the rope he had stretched from one of the trees further down the mountain, creating an escape option which he could use to swing down the slope of the mountain, and when he had gone as far as the escape option would allow, he could pull on the fishing line and it would be enough to loosen the slip knot so that it would be possible to pull the rope down and bring it with him to be used again. This would make for an excellent escape with one problem. He didn't really have time to figure out where the arc of the swing of the rope would take him. There simply wasn't time to figure it out. What he did know was that if a bear came at him in the dark he would have almost no time to react. But if he could get to the rope, which he would stake right outside his tent, he could grab it out of the ground and swing out and let the arc of the swing take him far away from where the bear was located. It was a sound plan if it came to that. These things were tricky, however. Even trickier than the gravity knot, because once he put his weight on the rope it was anybody's guess whether the fishing line would be strong enough to pull the knot loose. They had a tendency to tighten up after weight is applied, and who could guess whether the fishing line would break before it was able to loosen the knot? Hopefully none of this would ever be tested, but one thing Jerry was confident was that fortune favors the prepared. In other words, if you do get in a tight spot and want to be able to escape by the skin on your teeth, then you better have some sort of working plan. Under the time restrictions he thought he had done pretty well. Jerry used his flashlight to find some more suitable firewood because what he had used to get a fire started was now beginning to become more ash than fuel. He found a pretty good sized limb that had fallen from somewhere up above, which was well seasoned and, aside from not being cut to lengths, perfect for a campfire. He stuck the bigger end into the fire and added a few of the smaller pieces of pine he found laying close by. Next he dug out his trout and got them started cooking. Jerry stood holding his bear spray in one hand and his last-ditch M80 Mexican firecracker in the other. He positioned himself so that the campfire was between him and the only way into the camp that would be easy to use. To say it was a lonely feeling out there in all that darkness, camped on that mountainside steep slope overlooking a valley which he knew was down there but just not visible, would be as much of an understatement as claiming you could see straight while having your head locked into a running paint mixer. He felt like he was the only human being left in the world. There wasn't one single light promising a hint of civilization. Not in any direction. He listened intently into the darkness for any sign of something moving in on his camp, but all he heard was the crackling of his campfire and the occasional sizzle of his fish cooking. The smell of cooking trout was undeniable. Jerry had went ahead and used all the fish because after tonight he didn't want whatever had been tracking him to a further reason to follow. Once he was free of the scent of food, he would know whether the company following him was a predator of serious threat or if it was just a hungry critter looking for a handout or maybe some scraps left to rot in the woods. Jerry picked up the big limb that he had set into the fire and moved it slightly over so that the fire could reach further along it. The fish would be ready soon, so he dug out a cutting board that doubled as his plate, and was his emergency dry wood to start a fire, which he had cut the thing halfway through every 1-inch interval so it could be broke into 1-inch by 7-inch lengths. He also carried a small vial of diesel fuel which he used a tiny amount to start the fire that evening. He had a Bowie knife, a small pocket knife which had a regular blade and a paratrooper's hook on it, which was an old-time spring-loaded gadget that allows a paratrooper to cut himself free of a parachute using only one hand to open the knife, and the hook was sharp on the inside of its curve so you could easily get it around a parachute cord and sever the thing without much trouble. There were 3 packs of beef jerky remaining in his pack. The second M80 Mexican firecracker and his canteen which currently held half its volume. He also had some weed and a half pint of Bacardi 151, which also doubled as a second option for starting a fire. Only in emergency, of course. As already mentioned, he had a reel of fishing line, and also in the pack were several hooks, a bobber and some artificial lures. Last, he had a length of small diameter rope which he used to make snares or for whatever emergency that might arrive, which it could serve as a solution. As alone as Jerry felt, being the only visible source of light for any direction as far as he could see, it felt like an emergency which justified digging out the Bacardi. As he stood taking small sips of the potent libation, Jerry listened up the mountainside from the direction he had come. He still didn't hear anything. Maybe what had been tracking him had given up? He kept an eye from the time he started his downward hike, because along this area where the slide had happened the trees still had not regained their dominance and you could see back up to where he had started the climb down. Nothing had been visible, so if something followed him down it was done after dark or by staying to the cover of the pines that were standing back over where it was much steeper of a decline. Something could have paralleled him by staying to the standing pines, but it would have taken a heck of an effort to do so and not make any noises which would gather suspicion. It was pretty steep over there. He wouldn't bet the farm on it, but he figured it might be too steep for a bear to climb down, and especially doing so quietly. No, if he was going to get attacked he figured it would come from the direction he had come. The fish were ready, but he was still waiting for the attack. All he heard in the darkness that surrounded his camp was the sound of the insects going about their business. Whatever that might have been. He waited almost until his fish had gotten cold before relaxing his vigil enough to eat. The scraps were put into the fire to become ash. Now there was no reason for an animal to be coming after him unless it meant to kill him for food. He stood by the fire into the early morning. He was tired, but somewhere in the back of his mind was a voice saying he wasn't safe and that he shouldn't let his guard down. Around 10:30 he heard a pack of coyotes begin what he imagined were their nightly howls coming from the valley below. Soon another pack started in and then another. They echoed throughout the valley, making it sound like there were 10 packs scattered around the vast, open darkness. Jerry dug out his weed and rolled a joint to help put him to sleep for the night. He took another good sip of the Bacardi 151 and put it away for the night. There was still one more night ahead of him, and if tomorrow was anything like today he would need a drink before going to sleep. He lit the joint and stared into the fire, watching the bright orange embers take flight into the night air, and then saw their orange turn to a dim yellow and then to nothing as their ash was continued to be carried upwards by the wind and the fact it is lighter than the air surrounding it. Jerry was still in a defensive position so that the fire was between him and the only side of the flat area where he had made camp an attack might come. When he was staring into the fire looking at the orange embers, he began to see 2 orange embers that were not going out. In fact, if anything, they seemed to be getting, not brighter, closer. He had been half in a stupor, what with having the drinks and then a few toquiche on the joint. Suddenly it came rushing to him that it was not orange embers he had been staring at, watching. And the reason they had not gone out, had actually seemed to be growing bigger, be refusing to be carried upwards with the wind, was because they were. They did not go out because they were not embers. They did not move from the 6 or 7 feet off the ground where they remained constant because that was what a pair of eyes did. They were eyes, a dull orange-yellow color that seemed to be glowing in the darkness. They were coming down the mountainside along the very same path he had taken to reach his campsite. Jerry watched for a minute and then got moving. He went into his tent and packed his backpack with everything except the tent. There wasn't going to be time to pack it up. He came out of the tent and could see the eyes had made considerable distance in the short time he was busy packing. He hated the idea of leaving a fire burning by itself but couldn't bring himself to put it out. For some unknown reason even to himself, Jerry felt a comfort because the fire existed. He made sure it wasn't going to get away from the spot where he had built it, and then shouldered his backpack and grabbed his escape rope. He leaned backwards, putting the first bit of weight on the rope since he had tied it off. Of course the rope gave a bit but it settled down and held. He swung out away from the ledge of the flat spot where the tent was still pitched and went flying through the dark night like a drunk on a zip line. When the rope reached the point where it was going to start swinging back the other way, he took hold of the reel of fishing line that he had tied to the end of the rope and let go. He crashed into the ground not too far below and did a fair job of preventing himself from rolling down the slope. Now he had some decisions to make. He could turn on his flashlight, which he would have to do anyway to be able to move through the forest, but he could do that keeping the beam covered so that it would not be visible from any distance. Or he could use the beam to locate the end of the rope and try to see if the slip knot would come loose using the fishing line. It was a tough decision because there might be a spot or two ahead which he could really use the rope, but on the other hand whatever it was that he just escaped from was not all that far away and it was sure to see his beam of light if he tried to find the rope. In the end he decided to leave the rope and try to stay stealthy. He had a fair head start on whatever it was that was coming down the mountainside, and the only way to ensure that distance between them stayed the same was to assume Bright Eyes, as he had decided to call it, was still on the move after him. That meant he also had to keep moving. It was slow going, moving down the mountainside while keeping the flashlight beam covered as best he could. Jerry could hear something moving way back up the mountain, but he didn't see those glowing eyes. He could barely make out where the tent was still pitched because of the glow the fire was still producing. He was of course happy to see the fire had not caught any of the forest on fire. About an hour before the sun came up, Jerry lost the use of his flashlight. There was one more set of fresh batteries in his backpack, so he had to stop and fish them out. This gave him opportunity to listen again for what might be trailing, and he was not disappointed. Unfortunately, the sound of something coming down the mountainside behind him was still very much there. It was a very non-deliberate collection of snapped branches, pebbles being dislodged and then rolling down the grade until finding a spot to rest, or a small landslide of dirt and dirt chunks also displaced by the feet of whatever was coming. Jerry struggled in the dark to find the batteries. He wasn't really klutzy, and the thought crossed his mind that he was actually making good time, but because he was so anxious it just seemed like he was going slow. Finally he found the pair and tried to be quiet as he wrangled them out of their package and then shoved them into the flashlight, getting the light working again. He cupped the end where the light came out and did his best to keep it from being visible to whatever was behind him. So far his efforts didn't seem to be helping much, but he worried, what if they were? If he were to stop, would that thing would be on him in no time? He couldn't take the chance, so he continued to try and be as quiet and hard to spot as possible. Jerry was never so happy to see the sun coming up as that morning. When it was providing enough light to see, he cut the flashlight beam to save it for his last night in the woods. Up ahead there came the howls of another pack of coyotes. Or perhaps it was one of the bunch he heard the night before. Probably was. About an hour later those same howls turned to yelps, and then he heard the unmistakable growl of a canine voicing its intent to attack with full force if not left alone. Then came the growls and snarls of a dog, then it was the sounds of a pack of dogs in a fight to the death. It was a most unsettling thing to have heard, knowing you were going to have to walk right through the carnage. He was hungry, so he sat down and dug out some beef jerky and began eating. That was when he noticed the hoof prints. Strangely bigger than any deer tracks he had seen before. It wasn't really a big deal though, that is, until he found the dead coyotes. Then he felt a streak of ice flow through his veins. Admittedly, Jerry was no expert at tracks. However, there were only 2 sets of tracks around the kill zone. He guessed that is what you would term an area where 6 coyotes, 2 half-grown and 4 adults, had been shredded. They weren't in what you would term as pieces because whatever it was that cut them up had not went so deep as to cut all the way through. But it looked like it came close in places. He saw some dog prints made from the blood they had splashed through, go off in the direction he had to travel. The hoof prints followed. He judged it to have happened in that order because the red paw prints were pierced by the hoof prints, not the other way around. It didn't take an expert in the wilderness to know that was a very odd thing. Especially considering the carnage he had seen done to the coyote pack. Shouldn't things be the other way around? A bunch of deer slaughtered, not a bunch of coyotes. If he wasn't in such a haste to get out of these woods, it would have been curious enough to have followed the tracks to see what was the outcome between the remaining coyote and the deer that was following it. As mentioned, he had to go in that direction anyhow, so it seemed as good a path to follow as any he could make on his own. So he followed, making the 3rd set of tracks going in the same direction. By lunchtime, Jerry had either lost the trail or he had inadvertently strayed from the path made by the other 2 animals. Or that was his original conclusion when he discovered he was no longer following any tracks. Odd they would end at the same place? But then again, as he thought, the other possibility, that he had simply strayed from their path, seemed the more likely possibility. After having walked for such a period, he reached a point where he basically forgot about the tracking and was more focused on the most direct route out of the wilderness so he could get something to eat besides beef jerky. That is why it was such a surprise to see the coyote's body draped over a small pine tree like a fur coat hung from some new type of coat rack. Its stomach had been ripped open and most of the inner workings of the animal were nowhere to be seen. Not that Jerry was making a big effort to find them. Just something you cannot help but notice when you see something like that. It was a greatly intimidating scene, to be sure. He had no choice but to step past it, however, and keep trudging along. At least he had reached the upper end of the valley and could now follow a stream all the way out to where his car was waiting. It would be another day and a half, but he saw light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. He didn't stop that day like he had all the others when it got to the hottest part. Instead, he pushed onward. There were enough trees along the stream to provide him with shade about half the time. When he got really hot, he would stop and cool himself in the stream. It really was a lovely walk, if not for wanting to get home so badly. By the end of that afternoon, with only a few hours of daylight remaining, Jerry began to hear something way back behind him again. After finding the coyotes all shredded and then the last one disemboweled, he was considerably paranoid. It could be nothing more than a skunk or raccoon making their way in the same direction, but his spidey sense was tingling off the charts. Something dreadful was back there, and it had first killed the coyotes and left them around in shredded pieces and then ripped the stomach out of the one that tried to run. Now it was again on his trail. He had plenty of time to think up different scenarios. Sometimes it was a bear. Sometimes a mountain lion. Once he even imagined it was a Native American tribe that had never surrendered to the white man and was still at war with them. He thought of every possible threat to a man which was possible to come upon out where he was located. But he never once imagined what it was that finally showed itself. By the time that night had rolled around, Jerry was exhausted and needed to rest. At the same time, however, his fear was keeping him moving, but now that it had become dark out again, he was forced to either use the flashlight or stop his escape until there was enough light to see. The problem was that he thought he saw those glowing orange-yellow eyes. At first it was too light to make them out. Then as it got darker, he became more and more certain he was right. Then he had the most unsettling of all conclusions. The eyes hadn't become easier to see because it was getting darker out. They were getting easier to see because they were getting closer. Upon that realization, it was as if Jerry had come out of a trance. Immediately he wondered how much time had been lost during the period where he was staring at those eyes. Those glowing orange eyes. He would have to use the flashlight if he wanted to keep moving. A glance back behind him answered the question. He could no longer see the eyes. The last time that happened, the next time he saw them, they were a lot closer than they should have been. He didn't want that to happen this night, so he kept moving while turning off the flashlight whenever conditions allowed it. He would turn off the light whenever the contour of the land just ahead was flat enough or that offered no obstacles. Every time before he would get to a point where he needed to turn the flashlight back on, he would spend half a minute looking and listening behind him. There was no mistaking it. The eyes were back and they seemed to be gaining on him. He figured it was the mode of travel. No longer was he going to worry about keeping the light covered when he had it on. The problem now was that he was keeping the light off as much to save battery life as he was in order to be stealthy. Whatever the case, the simple fact was that he was not covering enough ground at a fast enough rate. Up ahead in the distance he heard the howls of another coyote pack. There were probably packs all up and down along this stream. Am I being crazy? Jerry asked himself. Would a sane person be going to such effort to outrun something that hasn't even proven to exist? Well, okay, he believed it existed, but if he was completely honest, he hadn't even seen the eyes up close enough to be certain that there was even a body attached to them. How much damage can a pair of floating eyes do anyway? Easy to say when you aren't out in the middle of the woods with no civilization in sight and you feel like something evil is after you. When all you can be sure of is there are a pair of eyes that seem to glow in the dark coming after you. It was wearing on him like a pair of shoes one size too small. But whenever he would think about taking a break, he would think about those coyotes and it kept him moving. Jerry figured he was only about 12 hours from his car and freedom from whatever was chasing him. He was about 8 hours from sunup. Right now, making it to sunup was the immediate goal. Continuing to parallel the stream that wound through the valley floor made for some dark travel due to there being so many trees growing along the stream, but now the moon was making an appearance out of the east and it was providing some much needed overhead illumination. The sound of the stream picking up speed gave an encouraging lift to Jerry's spirits as he was beginning to feel like he had finally reached the last leg of his journey. Now that the moon was providing some light, the last night he would be spending in these woods didn't look so bad. Yes, he was still feeling the anxiety of being followed and it certainly had been his cause for haste, but at the end of most days he still loved the outdoors, so it was impossible to not appreciate the warm summer night allowing for such comfortable travel. As Murphy's Law would often prove, things didn't stay nice for very long. However, the solution was an easy fix and easier choice on such a warm summer evening. He came upon a section of the valley basin which was overgrown with sticker and thorn bushes. Though he didn't walk it to find out, it appeared as if the thorns went on for a long way. Possibly all the way to the side of the valley. Jerry would have to either try to walk around the obstacle, which it appeared would be at least a long way, or he could cross into the stream and wade past the thorns. Because it was such warm night, he chose to wade into the stream. It was what he would have termed an ankle breaker because the water was only about shin high, but the rounded pebbles and rounded rocks that lined the bottom of the stream were very hard to traverse. It only took a few seconds before Jerry concluded the safest way to get where he wanted to go was to sit down and scoot. The current helped him along and all he needed to do was to be careful to not get the stuff he wanted to keep dry. That wasn't too big of a problem because he carried a couple of trash bags just for this kind of occasion, not to mention that in pinch they made for great roof liners on lean-to or any sort of shelter one might try to improvise. He put his pack and anything he wanted to stay dry, including his shoes and socks, into the plastic trash bag, and then he twisted the bag and tied it shut. Next he tied the bag to his person using a length of string he had with him. Then he simply slid out into the current and let himself basically float down the stream. The water was cold and definitely refreshing. He came out when the fauna along the stream began to fall off. There was a miniature sandbar where he made land. He got up where it was dry and began looking through the trash bag for his flashlight. Just as his hand went around the flashlight, he saw them on the other side of the stream. The eyes. They were a ways off but clearly headed straight for him. Jerry quickly finished grabbing the flashlight and turned it on to see while he quickly pulled on his socks and then shoes. He didn't take his eyes off the glowing eyes the entire time. As it grew closer, he noticed the eyes were not just an orange-yellowish color, but rather he would have described them as having yellow where the white should have been, and the color of the eyes were actually the color of fire. The color danced in and out of intensity just in the same manner a fire would behave. Then he noticed something else that had escaped his observation, or else it had just begun happening. He thought it likely the former. The eyes never faltered. It was like the body attached to the eyes was floating across the ground rather than taking steps. Or else it never made a misstep because the eyes stayed steady. Jerry suddenly shook his head and was angry at himself. How much time had elapsed during the period he was making these observations? The eyes seemed closer than they should be when he focused his attention back on them. He only allowed himself a second to make that last glance. He didn't want to fall into a trance again. There was cause to fear that the hypnotizing effect they had might grow stronger the closer they got. That was the impression they left when he forced himself to look away that last time. Then he was racing through the underbrush that made up his side of the stream. While zigzagging his way through the local fauna, he heard Old Bright Eyes cross the stream to his side. It didn't sound hurried, but all the same the pressure to put more distance between it and himself was greatly increased. Now, not worrying about whether the flashlight beam gave away his position, he was able to use the beam to search the entire landscape ahead instead of keeping the beam focused directly in front of his progression, so he was able to spot an area ahead that had an incline he could travel up, and it would give him a good view of the area he would have to traverse in the near future. From the high viewpoint, Jerry could see he was best off to cross the stream and stay on the other side for a distance. Before getting down from the spot, he turned his flashlight beam back behind him to see what was coming and was shocked to see a set of antlers moving among the underbrush. They were of considerable size, but what really freaked him was the thought that this was the same creature which had killed the coyotes. It had to be. How many predator deer are likely to be out there hunting down packs of coyotes and apparently the occasional human being? He didn't hang around to ponder the question. Instead, he raced down from the high point and crossed the stream and began making his way up that side. After practically running down the stream bed once he made it to the other side, Jerry had to stop and rest. His body was exhausted and the adrenaline which had been pushing him forward was starting to subside, leaving him tired and hungry. He decided to stop and dig out some beef jerky, and while he was eating, his body could rest. Jerry listened intently for anything out of the ordinary while he chewed his beef jerky. While running, he had a few new thoughts come. One was how the noise from the insects seemed to wane when he saw the eyes had gotten close. That was something good to know, because it might be the only warning he got before it reached him. The second thing wasn't so comforting. He remembered the scrub brush where he had seen the antlers moving, and that stuff was as tall as he was, taller in places. Yet those antlers were clearly visible moving along the top of the brush line. By that scale, it meant that the deer was at least 6 feet tall from ground to the top of its head. That is not counting the height of the antlers themselves. Jerry thought to himself, that's a pretty big deer. In fact, he didn't recall ever seeing a deer that big, nor had he heard of one. Could it be an elk? And even if it was, do they get that tall or big? What else has antlers that look like a deer? He tried to think of even the most absurd possibilities, but nothing has a rack like a deer except elk. So it must be a giant elk. Even elk didn't get that tall or big, did they? Well, they must, if that was what was attached to that big rack. He supposed it could be some weird version of a witch doctor roaming the mountains wearing a set of deer antlers strapped to his head. But it wasn't too likely. Jerry thought he heard the sound of something crossing the stream back behind him. Now there wasn't even a stream to separate the two. He would have liked to cross back to the other side, thus always keeping the water between them, but the travel was too easy where he was at. It would have been counterproductive to cross the stream. Such an action might put his mind at ease in the short term, because he would again have the sound of something crossing the creek to serve as early warning. By crossing over, it might slow his progression overall, however. That would leave an opportunity for Bright Eyes to get ahead of him. As bad as it was having this thing on his tail all the time, it still was better than some of the alternatives which might likely happen if he slowed his pace. The biggest being that it would get ahead of him and force him to have to get past it in order to reach his destination. So far he had been able to avoid that unpleasantness. Jerry's flashlight was just about done. He figured he had about 3 hours to go from his current situation before the sun made its morning appearance. This was going to be interesting because the moon was also just about to leave the game. Already things were becoming too dark to see good enough to move through the remainder of the night without artificial light source. Jerry found a spot to sit down and opened his backpack and pulled out some of his beef jerky. He sat chewing on it and kept his attention to where the deer antlers were likely to be coming. After all, if this was the same thing that had been following him from the start, then it wasn't likely to give up now. What did it want from him? Obviously this was no ordinary deer, or elk. It was something else. Something bigger, or at least taller. And obviously it had a demeanor which was not ordinary for such an animal. A breeze made itself known. It was blowing from the same direction as he just had come. An odor seemed to be wafting in, and it wasn't a pleasant one. Frankly, it smelled like something was dead. What was weird was it was coming from the direction which he had just come, and he hadn't noticed the stench before. This wasn't something you wouldn't notice. He lost his appetite and spit out what beef jerky was still in his mouth. Jerry searched behind him for any sign of the glowing eyes, but all he saw was darkness. The insects were buzzing along, so there was no reason to be worried more than before. Still, it was the smell that bothered him. The stench of something dead is very offensive to the average human being. Unmistakable as it is, relentless as it is offensive. It is also nearly as contagious. Never touch something dead, because it will stay with you and everything you touch will also stink. That odor was becoming stronger and stronger. Jerry packed up his stuff back into the backpack, which he then covered with the trash bag, and then he was up and on his way. Then, after only going a short distance, he became aware that the stench was not getting weaker, it was getting stronger. How could that be? It was just behind him. There was no getting around the fact, however, that the smell was growing as he made his way forward. Jerry turned out his flashlight to conserve what battery was left. Sitting there in complete darkness, he felt terribly vulnerable. It was too dark to travel any further, and his flashlight had reached a point where he thought he ought to save the rest of the power in case he needed to run for his life. So far the thing coming for him had done so at no fast pace. He thought he might be able to outrun it in the short term. Regardless, he was going to have to be able to see if he ran, so if he didn't save some of the flashlight he would be sorry. Then he got an idea which would allow him to keep moving even in the darkness. It would be a slow go, but at least he would be able to continue getting closer to safety. He could get back into the stream and continue floating his way out of there. Maybe the water depth would be a little deeper now that he was further downstream. If he could actually be able to swim with the current, he could make good time. Jerry tried to remember if there were any falls or other such obstacles which might cause him harm if he were to get into the stream and use it to get out of the territory. Where his car was parked was the only falls along this stream which he knew about. Coming in, he didn't stay right to the stream's path, so he wasn't entirely sure there were no falls, but he thought he would be okay. It seemed like a risk worth taking. The other choice was to sit and wait for either the sun to rise or for something to come along and find him, most likely sleeping. Jerry was about spent. He knew if he sat in the darkness he was likely to fall asleep. Getting into the water would wake him up. It seemed like a win-win. He slipped off his shoes and socks and used his flashlight to see to get into the current of the stream, and then put the flashlight back into the protection of the trash bag. Now totally in the dark, he began to float down the stream. The water was indeed deeper here. It allowed for him to hold onto the trash bag and use the air trapped inside it as a flotation device. Jerry couldn't see 2 feet in front of him, but he just trusted the current and tried to stay in the strongest part. He thought he might be making better time than if he had stayed alongside the stream and used his flashlight to get through the landscape. Several times during his float he smelled that awful dead odor, but he never saw the eyes. When he finally stopped his progress in the stream, the sun was up over the horizon in the east. Jerry made his way home without further incident. He doesn't know for certain what was after him, but he believes it was after him. Maybe he lost it when he got into the water, which would infer the thing was following him by scent rather than by vision. Which sorta makes sense when you consider it was able to follow him in darkness as well as daylight. What sort of body was attached to those glowing eyes will remain a mystery. This writer cannot help but believe it was a Wendigo. It makes sense. They are supposed to hate dogs, thus the coyote deaths. Supposedly they crave human flesh, which would explain why it never gave up trying to catch up with Jerry.